Good afternoon. I'm Chris McGinley, Senior Research Fellow and leader of the Age and Diversity Research Space at the Helen Hamlin Centre for Design. And welcome to the Age and Diversity session of Design Different. We've a truly packed hour for you, so I should really dive in and whiz through what's ahead quite quickly. We'll begin with a quick 2020 Age and Diversity overview for myself, followed by an introduction by Colm Lowe to the much anticipated Design Age Institute, a truly exciting and much needed call to action for the ageing market. It's been a hope of the centres for decades and a personal goal of mine to shake up the way we think about ageing and to create positive change and tangible impact through design. You'll then get to hear from a selection of our researchers that you can see on the screen, or you will see shortly if you can. And they'll give you an overview of 3 very different live projects from this year. Then Colm will take the stage again, or our screen, and he'll present you with a provocative take on innovating in the ageing space, laying out just how much of a challenge we're undertaking here. And then we'll finish up with a panel session, which will give you a chance to put questions to our presenters, allow us time to reflect on some polls that will come up periodically through the presentations, and just to have a bit of a chat. So, 2020, what a year, and it's not done yet. It's been bizarre and it's no doubt been challenging, but an interesting side effect has been the many ways that issues pertinent to the age and diversity space have been magnified through the COVID lens. These have included issues such as isolation, inequality, health, connection, communication, or lack thereof in lots of cases, and the changing role of technology in our day-to-day lives. These topics have been at the forefront of all our minds, and at the HHCD, they've been at the forefront of our research as well. So this year, we've been challenged to think on our toes as our people-centered projects have shifted at various points of development from face-to-face engagements and in situ explorations to conversations over phone or Skype or Zoom or Teams or Hangouts or House Party or any of the many online video call services that are now part of our everyday. Everything we typically do has had to be rethought to maintain meaningful exchange. Creative design kits have been couriered to kids, cultural probes have captured later life needs to be discussed from afar over those same video forums I just mentioned, and online exhibitions and social media initiatives have ensured we've progressed our conversations around new inclusive futures. Oddly, COVID hasn't slowed things down for us, quite the opposite. Our lockdown has allowed time for reflection, time to focus on unheard voices unfairly represented. Never has the need for inclusion in all we do been more clear. And as we emerge from this, these experiences and memories have to be our driving force. As people-centered designers, we know life is messy and design is all about complexity and negotiating constraints. The creativity isn't only about the end output, it's the way we frame problems and the routes we take to solve them. So, not only have our current projects stood strong through these COVID times, we also have a host of really exciting projects lined up for the coming year. We'll be pioneering a completely new model of later life rentals in partnership with the innovative architecture firm Cartwright Pickard through a government-funded knowledge transfer partnership, the RCA's first. We start a new partnership with Invisible Creations, which couldn't be a better fit. Their goal is to design for dignity, creating products that are desirable and defined by function and finesse, not age. And we'll be starting a new chapter with Heart and Soul, the award-winning creative arts company and charity, injecting the talent and insight of people with learning disabilities and autism into health services design. And I couldn't talk about 2020 without mentioning my PhD candidates, Laura Salisbury and Silke Hoffman, both of whom are speeding towards completion of practice-based PhDs, true labours of love, especially given the challenging year. Their material and garment developments are extraordinary, with huge potential to radically change the lives of people post-stroke and post-mastectomy. I can't reveal too much as they're both currently finalising IP rights and development funding, but these are radical and disruptive innovations that you really want to look out for in the coming year. So we've certainly been keeping busy, and 2021 looks like a bumper year. And with that, I'll hand you over to Colm to tell you about our exciting, shiny new Design Age Institute. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Yes, Design Age Institute. I'd like to just give you a brief introduction, spend 5 minutes. And for those who attended Monday night's symposium, I suppose I need to apologize a little bit because we're quite new. I only have one introduction to the Design Age Institute at this minute in time, so it will be the same. I have added one new slide at the end, which if you can spot it, well done. So we are a new institute. We have been funded and we are founded, but we haven't really had a formal launch yet. So this week really marks the start of our public engagement with the Design Age Institute. So I'll start with who we are. So it's a new partnership funded by Research England, and there's 5 partners: the Helen Hanlon Centre for Design at the Royal College of Art, the Oxford Institute for Population Ageing at Oxford University, the National Innovation Centre for Ageing at Newcastle, and the Design Museum, and then finally the International Longevity Centre. And for reasons, technology reasons, so is there a problem changing the slides? I don't know whether if somebody could hit click. So what are we? Well, we are the national, yes, if we could move on a slide, please. This seems to be struggling with the, so we're the National Strategic Unit for Design and the Healthy Ageing Economy. And we've been set up by the government to tackle their grand challenge on ageing, and specifically to enjoy 5 extra healthy, independent years of life and to support people to remain at work longer. And we'll be doing this by building consumer markets that better meet the needs and then driving improvements across social care. And later on in this presentation, we'll be talking about meeting the better needs of consumer markets in more detail. So why are we? Why is there a need for a Design Age Institute right now? Well, this slide for me best sums up what we're experiencing. Over the last sort of 12,000 years, the average age of the human being has remained fairly constant at between 20 and 30 years. But in the last 200 years, it has rocketed. We have kind of got through the Stone Age, got through the Bronze Age, got through the Iron Age, even the Industrial Age and part of the Silicon Age. And some of us have got through Middle Age, but we are now definitely in the age of aging. And as we get older, we would like to think that when we need new products and services, that they will look like this, that our houses will be filled with lovely new ideas. Unfortunately, if you want to buy some of these products, this is what they look like. And there's only one thing that terrorizes me more than aging, and that is filling my house full of stuff that looks like this. And what's more concerning is that at least 4 in 5 of those aged over 55 say their favorite retail brand, this is their favorite retail brand, does not understand them and what they need. So there is a clear market failure in this area. And that's what we plan to take a look at. And our mission is simply put to amplify the voice of people as they age and support a better functioning marketplace. And our vision to help people age happier. Put simply and visually, over time, it's hard to argue that we don't start to lose some abilities and become a little more frail as we age. And at some point, we will go from being able to do some things without assistance to being unable to do things without assistance. And mixing into that, there will be events that will happen to us, which are known as PELEs, potential end-of-life events. And they could be a diagnosis, a fall, dementia, some other condition that happens through the end of our life. And our job is to try to help people stay healthier for longer, to keep them less frail, to try to push back those potential end-of-life events, and if at all possible, introduce products and services that help people stay able for as long as possible. So we have 16 products or services towards market. That's our ambition, our big ticket items, get things to market or towards market, not just exemplars. And we'll be focusing on things like ability, to do with declining mental and physical ability, independence, tackling the main things that ends up meaning people have to go into care homes, things like managing your medication regime, nutrition, hygiene, and your finances. But more importantly, we want to be looking at things that keep people happy also. And that's about remaining in productive, interesting work, staying at home where there's a sense of place with or without care services, and then looking at connections, friends, family, and community. How can you stay connected and feeling loved? But most importantly, we want to stop designing products and services based on what people need. We want to start designing for what people want, and thinking about what makes people and keeps people happy. So this image at the beginning, Keith Richards. Everybody needs a sort of brand icon for a centre, and we may not end up with Keith, but we're starting with Keith because Keith is a happy man, not often described as the healthiest man, although nobody can really name me an illness he's had, but he is certainly happy. I certainly believe that we all have a responsibility to shape our lives, to make ourselves as happy as possible. And so a final thought is everybody just to embrace their inner Keith and do whatever you can to be happy. Thank you. Chris, back to you.
So we're now going to move on to one of our first research associates who will be presenting some work from Wellcome and Heart and Soul. It's Will Rennell.
Thanks, Colin, and thanks, Chris, and hi, everybody. I'm happy to be chatting to you today. My name's Will Rennell, and I'm one of the researchers from the Helen Hamlin Centre. And I'm going to take a bit of time today to talk to you about Heart and Soul at the Hub. Heart and Soul at the Hub is an interdisciplinary research project which is funded by the Wellcome Trust, and it's led by people with learning disabilities and autistic people. The project is kind of 2 years into its life cycle and is aiming to finish up in March 2021, so we're kind of on the home straight. And it's been tackling some big societal kind of chunky themes like exploring what is the value of difference and challenging this idea of a normal person. Just to give a little bit of context, so there are 1.5 million people in the UK with learning disabilities, 51% of which report feeling lonely. 32% of UK prisoners are people with learning disabilities, and people with learning disabilities are 3 times more likely to die from causes that could have been prevented by high quality healthcare. This is all within wider statistics of 2/3 of the British public feeling uncomfortable talking to a disabled person, 85% of young disabled adults feeling lonely, just 4% of the arts workforce in the UK identifying as disabled, and hate crimes rising by 150% over 2 years. And this is all stuff pre-COVID. So obviously it's a kind of interesting and challenging context. So within this, we've been aiming to bring together an interdisciplinary group of artists, academics, scientists, researchers, clinicians to uncover new insights into how relationships between people with and without learning disabilities could affect mutual well-being. We've been bringing forward ideas of love and productivity and value in our research. So I'll flick through some of the things that we've been doing. Early on in the project, something that Chris and I were involved in was a large access audit of the 5th floor of the Wellcome building. So we used inclusive design methods to position the needs, the interests, and the insights of people with learning disabilities at the heart of a physical redesign. And this is some of the things, some graphics taken from the report that we published on the back of that. What we've ended up with is a space that is not only fully accessible in terms of its physicality with accessible toilets and things, it also has a dedicated chill out room, but it's a space that's fun to be in, it's welcoming, and it reflects the people who populate that space. That was an early stage example of something we've done within the project. We also moved on to start engaging the public in some of our questions. So this is a slide from an exhibition that we created called The Wall of Change. We worked with an illustrator called Ben Connors and made a mural of objects and spaces that were reimagined by autistic people and people with learning disabilities. And we installed this at the Wellcome collection for 2 months, inviting members of the public to look at our ideas and to submit their own suggestions of things that they would most like to see change. We collected over 300 responses, and we used this data throughout the project to frame what we're doing. One of the ways that we brought that data to life was during Across RCA. So Across RCA is an annual week-long program that the Royal College of Arts hosts, and it offers students from across all of the schools within the college to collaborate. And it's an opportunity for projects that are live, like our Heart and Soul at the Hub project, to benefit from short, intense and focused bursts of input from students with a really kind of broad range of backgrounds and expertise. So myself and Chris designed a 4-day intensive co-design workshop in which 30 RCA students from across the college collaborated with 6 experts with learning disabilities to explore all of the data that we'd collected from the Wall of Change. And this culminated in another exhibition at the Wellcome Collection. More recently, we boiled down all of the findings from our research into themes and created a lot of visual material that was then installed as an installation and an exhibition at the Wellcome Collection. And this was another example of how we'd taken some of the traditional ways for data to be kind of controlled within an academic context and made them accessible to people with learning disabilities. So things were a lot more bright and colourful and chunky than a lot of the usual forms of kind of academic analysis. And this has been live within the Wellcome Collection the entire time that's been shut because of COVID. So we were up for a few weeks and then COVID struck. And so we've also moved the whole of the exhibition online, which has been an exciting and interesting way for us to take something that was extremely physical and move it into the digital space. So I'm aware of time, so I will just flick through some of the kind of implications and outputs of the project. We're intending to enable people with learning disabilities to have the power to lead, to take part in research on their own terms, and to put the medical and care practices which dictate many aspects of their lives under the microscope. We're looking to build a highly accessible and interactive website, which we will start to launch in the autumn. And this will contain audio, video, and social media content that we've used throughout our research. We'll publish papers and chapters that relate to the research and also create accessible alternatives to this. An example of a way that we've done this previously is alongside a paper we published earlier this year. We had a video explaining what the paper was talking about. We'll build an evidence base to inform policy around learning disability. We'll deliver a substantial program of events that are designed by people with learning disabilities. This has included talks and presentations as well as performances. And ultimately, we're looking to influence academic, cultural and scientific spaces in which people are visible and valued, specifically people with learning disabilities and autistic people and disabled people more broadly. Before I hand on, it seems to be going backwards. I'm going to pose a question. This is just an opportunity for you to reflect on some of the things that I've just said. So the question I have for you is, if the ultimate goal is a more inclusive future, then which of these themes from our project do you think needs to change the most? I'll give you a little bit of time to answer the question, and then there'll be a space during the panel discussion later where we can dive into these responses a bit more. Thanks very much. I will now hand you over to Imran.
Thank you so much, Will, for that awesome insight into your work. Hello, everyone. I'm Imran Nazarali. I'm a research associate in the space of age and diversity at the Helen Hamlin Center for Design. And today I will be taking you through this year-long project called Community. The partner of this project was the Guinness Partnership, who are a giant affordable housing and service provider with housing stock across the UK with a large focus on schemes for older people. The core purpose of this project was really to explore, discover, and create new age-inclusive ideas to be developed in housing design and the built environment for older people living in Guinness care schemes. The starting point of this project was really exciting oops, sorry, I think I've gone forward too fast. Sorry, yes, the Starter Points project was really exciting as it was the time to start understanding people and place. So I designed and sent out research kits in advance of meeting residents to get an idea about their perspectives of life, home, and technology. These were then followed up by face-to-face interviews to deeper understand their perspectives through conversation. From all of the ethnographic research carried out, there were key challenges that emerged. Challenge one was the desire to build stronger communities. Residents who've lived in housing for older people schemes for 10+ years spoke of a golden era where there were more social activities and connections. And although this still exists at some schemes, it was clear that there was still a strong, burning need for community and others. Challenge two was the importance of resident visibility. At some schemes, residents have lived in their apartment for many years and yet still don't know the people who live on their floor. Challenge number three was the need to increase resident ownership. Housing for older people schemes have independent living advisors who are essentially like building managers, but I'll elaborate on them a bit later on, and they have communal spaces. But the problem comes from residents feeling like their home begins at their apartment door rather than the main door to the wider building itself. And the fourth and final challenge was the importance of being heard, which was a really sensitive subject for residents. Some residents felt that like they're not heard when it comes to certain needs because they're just older people in sheltered housing, and that's clearly not the case. So although all of these challenges were of equal importance, Guinness, the Helen Hamlin Centre, and the captured voices of residents narrowed down the focus to these two spaces. Building stronger communities and strengthening residents' voices would be the focus moving forward. These focus spaces were still really large, and I kind of wanted to go back to basics and bring people together to understand what community actually means to them. As integrating technology was in the scope of this project, I also wanted to understand what home technologies residents enjoyed and what they struggled with. And lastly, I wanted to understand the current processes in place for residents getting their voices heard and exploring how that could be improved. So with all of the insights gathered up to this point, I wanted to start the flow of ideas. So I whipped out my little black book of funky designers and got together a group of global innovation design postgrad students and alumni from the Royal College of Art and Imperial College London to explore some concepts. To give you an idea of what some of these concepts and thoughts were, one focused on increasing ownership through communal spaces by turning them into studio-like areas that belong to each resident so that their space, their home space rather, extends to the wider building. The second was the idea of around making notice boards multi-purpose and digital. Residents had previously mentioned that updates go up on notice boards, but often become part of the furniture and actually become unnoticeable. The third idea was of residents connecting through digital dating services. Due to the success of older dating sites like Match and Silver Singles, the idea of connecting digitally emerged. And so at this point, we were having great interactions with residents and Guinness, and it was time to start prototyping ideas to share, but then COVID struck. Luckily, I'd built up some great relationships and was able to share prototypes and material remotely to develop ideas through a series of remote co-creation sessions. Lockdown also provided valuable time to reflect on the dense research carried out, which allowed new insights to emerge. The importance of the independent living advisors shone through. They weren't just building managers, rather core members of the community who knew residents well and were actually a conduit to amplify their voices to Guinness. Realizing that they were key stakeholders in the project meant that they were part of the concept development alongside residents. And together we created Community rather. This interactive installation is a physical place for community to meet and exchange. It's a focal point for gatherings, introductions, and a place to voice tensions. Essentially, it's a space for conversations to take place and more importantly, where connection and action happens. Residents can share their skills or interests with neighbors, tell others about events happening in or out of the community, and contribute ideas or feedback about shared spaces all anonymously. And the intention is to help residents thrive through the sharing of time and space together and provide a route to effect change in the place that they call home. And so we currently have the full designs for Community, including production, planning, and costing. When this concept was initially developed, the intent was to blend the physical and digital with a stronger focus on the physical space. However, due to COVID and the restrictions it brings, evolving the technology component has become critical in allowing people to engage while they're safe in their own home. So we've identified 2 sites within Guinness schemes that have different characteristics, qualities, and levels of community. And we intend to install Community not only to understand how a version 1 is engaged with, but also to learn what the tech digital blend should be for version 2. We've developed a technology roadmap with Guinness, and tech partners are being identified to help us realize this. This is extremely exciting for both the Helen Hamlin Centre and for Guinness, so stay tuned as community grows. Thank you for listening, and if you could take a moment to answer this poll question, that would be fantastic. And as Will mentioned, we can elaborate on the questions and answer some questions that you may have further on in the presentation. Just give a bit of time for you guys to answer. Super. Thank you ever so much for listening, everyone. And I will now be handing you over to Steve.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Imran. Oh, just a few little tech issues. Things keep popping up. Just give me a sec. All right. I could just go back a slide. There we go. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Steve Douch, a research associate in the age and diversity space. I'm going to be talking about Remain, an exciting collaboration that we've been working on with King's College London. The Remain project is developing a product to improve the diagnosis and monitoring of children with ADHD and is funded by the National Institute for Health Research. Our project started later than the other two projects that you've seen today, as we're only 6 months into our study. I'd just like to start by giving you a bit of background on ADHD for those that aren't familiar with it. Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, or ADHD, affects 1 in 25 children. Children with ADHD can have severe problems with inattention, impulsivity, and hyperactivity. This causes kids to struggle with learning at school. They find it harder to form and maintain friendships, and it can have a lasting impact on their happiness and well-being. Half of kids diagnosed with ADHD require medication. This really needs close monitoring by the adults around them to make sure that it doesn't affect their sleep and mood. Monitoring currently takes place via questionnaires to track a child's symptoms, but the accuracy of results can be influenced by the person completing them, and they can be all too subjective. There are also issues with reports not being returned to doctors and clinics not entering the data due to the system being too overstretched. Our aim is to reduce the inaccuracies that questionnaires present by developing a digital tool to measure a child's hyperactive movements. This will take the form of a small wristband, a bit like an activity tracker such as a Fitbit. The child would wear this wristband during the diagnosis and medication phase of their treatment. This eliminates the need for questionnaires, but also means that carers can track a child's progress. As you can imagine, developing such a tool presents some particular design challenges. Specifically, how do you create a medical wristband that won't be stigmatizing or cause bullying? How can we design a wristband for children with ADHD that will be engaging but not a further distraction? And how can we design a device that is small and lightweight but not easily lost? It's worth saying that all children are notorious for losing things, but this is more pronounced with children with ADHD. We're ready to tackle these issues head on, but then lockdown hit. This forced us to rethink our plan, as children with ADHD wouldn't be able to focus for the periods of time needed to do video chats. To tackle this, we designed and sent out fun activity packs to families, which gave children time to complete tasks at home and at their own pace, whilst providing us with key information. During lockdown, families were swamped with homework, so they were grateful to receive these creative packs full of craft materials to help them complete our drawing and making activities. This gave kids and parents respite from homeschooling. Some loved it so much that they just couldn't be pulled away from making. Activities included wearing a wristband for 48 hours. This gave us a real insight into the children's feelings and attitudes towards wearing a medical device. And to help kids understand what they want from our product, we got them to make their own versions. And on boy, did they go to town on these, creating all manner of weird and wonderful devices. We also gathered lots of really interesting insights on what it's like to live with ADHD. Although we've not finished our full analysis yet, I'd just like to share a little bit of what we've found so far. So I think there are important some learnings from our research that is perhaps most relevant to those working with neurodiverse groups. As a researcher, it can take time to build trust and rapport with a child. By getting a parent to assume this role, this hurdle is removed. Parents are also perfectly positioned to gauge a child's mood and productivity, meaning we gained a more accurate understanding of the child. Parents also fed back that the process improved their understanding of their child's needs. And perhaps most importantly, the children told us like they felt that their voice had finally been heard. So much has come out of this research. It's been really rich. Here are 4 key things that we've learned so far. Number 1, it's clear that one solution will not fit all. A lot of the children that we have in our group have coexisting medical conditions, such as ASD and dyspraxia. This means that we'll have to cater for their particular needs by giving them more choice. This might mean making our band modular, think something like a Lego kit for wristbands. Number 2, wristbands should be discreet. Surprisingly, our kids don't want big flashy wristbands. This should help us hide the product and avoid any stigmatization that they might come into contact with. Number 3, design should aim to be constantly worn, but should have a plan for when they get lost. It's essential that we develop a wristband that is comfortable enough for children to wear 24 hours a day for the 12-week initial medication period. But however hard we try, we know they might get lost. So we need to make sure that they're cheap enough for them to be easily replaced. And number 4, successful design should minimize burden. Parents of children with ADHD already have a lot to deal with, and we want to make this product really simple for them. This means removing any fiddly interaction on their behalf, like changing the batteries or charging it up. So what are our next steps? We're at a really exciting phase in our project as we wrap up our research and start to analyze our findings. We're planning to have a selection of prototypes on the Rista Kids by the end of the year, and successful designs will then be developed into 120 units that will be manufactured in collaboration with Mindpacks for a full trial next March. It's also worth saying that this is one component in a larger 4-year study that will further develop the product's features and companion applications. And hopefully this will have a massive impact on the lives of children living with ADHD. So thank you for listening, and I'd just like your feedback on this poll question. Thanks, everyone. I'd just like to hand you over now and back to Colin.
You're muted, Colin.
Sorry, I've just requested so I can start screen sharing again, and hopefully that will work a little better this time than it did last time. So back to me, Rama, who's hiding somewhere in the background, asked me to talk about something interesting, he said in this last little section. So I've picked market failure. What could be more interesting than that to talk about to conclude a workshop or a talk? It's particularly important to us because, as I said earlier, our job is to bring 16 products or services towards market in a 3-year period, not a small challenge. So market failure, or the failure to launch products to successfully innovate, is a big deal for us. And I suppose you could describe market failure as the economic situation defined by an inefficient distribution of goods and services in the free market. A group either incurs too many costs or receives too few benefits for goods received, which seems like a fine description. But what does that actually mean in terms when you look at it visually? So market economy is very straightforward. You have a supply side, you have a demand side, you have enablers somewhere in the middle that help bring those two together. The suppliers produce goods and services, and the demand side gives money, hopefully enough money so the supply side can make a healthy profit. That isn't actually, though, what happens in a lot of goods and services to the market that we're talking about, because the users are kind of pushed out of the equation, and in the middle somewhere we have something that might be called customers. And these can be retailers, but they can also be local authorities, the NHS, but Doesn't really matter. Anybody that gets in the way. And what tends to happen, the exchange of goods and money and services goes round in the circle, and the users find themselves somehow outside of this and are given or handed goods and services that have been designed for somebody else, either based on cost or what they think they need rather than what they know they want. So is there a problem? Well, we talked about this before. These don't exist. They're not real. They're prototypes, exemplars, and imagined. This is what we end up with. So as far as I'm concerned, yes, there's a problem. Now, all these objects on that page serve a function, and they do sell, and people have them in their homes, and they do technically work. And this is true, that the difference between having a car or having no car is huge, while the difference between having a Fiat or Ferrari is negligible when it comes to transport. In fact, some would argue a Fiat is better than a Ferrari at pure transport. So the people are getting things that work. The issue is they're so undesirable that they resist buying them and using them. So is this a question of horse before the cart? You know, as we age, we spend less money, so suppliers don't design for our needs and wants. Or is it, as we age, you know, suppliers don't design for our needs, so as we age, sorry, we spend less money? Which way around is that? And historically, it might have been people who grew up, you know, during or just after the war, the mend and make do generation, as they're sometimes referred to. Maybe they do spend less money, smaller pensions, etc. But in this era, that is not the case. People who are retiring now have good pensions, sitting on equity bubbles, and will buy their way out of problems if you can give them products and services that they want. I used to work for the NHS. I used to be head of design there, working in patient safety, and I used to spend all day looking at failure and errors and things that go wrong. And I think failure is something to be celebrated. It is something a designer is uniquely good at, because for every one product that comes out of the end of a design process, there are 499 at least failures that we rejected on the way through that process. So we kind of get failure and how important it is in the process of succeeding. And I used to produce lots of publications like this, design, you know, riveting reading, design for patient safety, injections, labeling, graphics, all sorts of things. These two are actually both produced by the Helen Hamlyn Centre over a decade ago, I think. And that was really part of my job, looking at how things go wrong and to stop them going wrong. One of the reasons things go wrong is what they call the valley of death. A wonderful term for basically just the money runs out. If you've thought of a great idea for a new product, you start getting it, you think it's great, you're in love with it, it's your product, it's your idea, you start investing, you build prototypes, you take them to places, you invest. And for a lot of people, eventually, the money just runs out before you've got to that point in the journey where you're making enough profits to break even or to repay the debt and stay afloat, and that companies just don't quite get to the end point of a successful business. However, in the public sector, we know of the valley of death as something a bit different. There is a kind of process where, you know, the universities do lots of research, they come up with great scientific breakthroughs, engineers turn that into a technology, with designers maybe even into a product and service, it launches and it becomes profitable. A lot of the time, the first half of this is funded by the public sector in grants, competitions, investments, universities, etc. The public or university sector invests in this. And then they expect somewhere in the middle, the private sector will take over, take that bit of technology and commercialize it and make it successful. But in the middle, they collaborate and it all works wonderfully. That's the idea. And there's a little valley of death there. And the valley of death, the dip between the two mountains is where the private sector does not pick up the reins, start investing in this wonderful new science and technology and get it to market. And that's because the graph or the chart doesn't really look like that. It looks like this. The public sector investment is not significant compared to the overall costs of bringing a product successfully to market, and the collaboration tends to be minimal. So actually, you know, getting that science and technology onto a shelf in Tesco is hugely expensive. And that's why the valley of death, as we know in the public sector, exists. So we must overcome that somehow. But there's another way to look at failure. So this is a slide I used to use when I was with the National Patient Safety Agency, looking at perfection and how people cannot perform perfectly. But what it's basically trying to say is that on the top left, you can see that if you do one thing with 95% success, 5 things will go wrong every 100 times you do it. But if you've got 25, 50, or 100 different steps, if you're acting at 95% perfection, by the time you go through those 100 steps, you are having a success rate that is nearly negligible. Even if you go right to the far end of the scale, where your success rate is, you're making an error every I think it's 100,000 operations, you make one error. If the steps are 100, it means 1 in every 100 will be default. And in the NHS, that means if you perform with 100, with almost 100% efficiency, but just less, you can harm 1 in 100 patients. This is what this slide was used for. And I just noticed recently, actually, there's an error on this slide that I put together. And after talking about this for 4 years, I've only just realized there's an error on this slide. I made a mistake when I put it together. If anybody can spot it, please bring it up in the chat. But I'll move on before you can. So I thought I would take a failure mode and effect analysis approach to why bringing products and services to market fail. So FMEA is a common tool in complex industries, and it simply means looking at every mode at which something might fail, and then looking at what the effect of that failure might be as it goes forward. And so I thought I'd apply this to the entrepreneur's typical journey, or the innovation journey. So the question is, with what degree of certainty can you identify an actual need in your customer base? The second step is, you've identified a need in your customer base, but are there enough customers to launch a profitable and sustainable business? Or are you just designing a potato peeler for your grandmother? The third one is, will your solution actually solve the problem? Or is it just one of those things that you create and it's nice to have and it works for your grandmother, but nobody else? The fourth is, even if you can identify the need and solve it, can you do it in a way that people want to buy it? Not need to buy it. We all need all sorts of things, but want to buy it. The fifth one is market access. And this is where things start to go horribly wrong for a lot of entrepreneurs I've worked with in the past. Can you get your product or service in front of your customers? In other words, can you get it on the shelf in Tesco? If you're manufacturing a potato peeler, to put that potato peeler on a shelf in Tesco, Tesco have to stop selling one of their existing potato peelers. So what is it about yours that is better than theirs? And how are you going to get access to Tesco? And how are you going to get the buyer to buy your product? So how can you get your product or service in front of your customers? And then how can you tell your customers that it exists and it's better than all the other potato peelers? And this is quite expensive. Those last two are really quite expensive to do. And have you budgeted for that? And what happens if it doesn't work quite as well as you thought it would be? What confidence are you? You will have enough money, enough clout to make that work. Do you have the funds, therefore? Will you run out of money and fall into one of the valleys of death and fail to get your product funded right to the end? And then lastly, can you produce your potato peeler and sell it at a price that returns a healthy profit for you, allowing you to grow the business and stay profitable? And if you can honestly answer 100% to each one of those questions, then that's great. You are guaranteed to succeed. However, more likely you will go, well, yeah, I'm pretty sure, mainly sure, mostly sure. But with going through those 8 steps, if you're only mainly sure at 90%, your product only has a 43% chance to succeed. And I would still say, if you can be 90% sure you can get your product in front of the customers and you can fund everything to the end, and you're going to do it for a profit, and you've identified a real need, a real niche, got a real solution, and everybody wants it, 90% is pretty high. I think it looks more like this. At the beginning, you can be confident. You've got a prototype, you've got a mock-up, mood boards, whatever it might be. But towards the end, how can you be sure? And if those percentages are true, then the chances of success for that product suddenly look pretty difficult. So the question is, how do you make sure that those 8 aspects are all improved as much as you possibly can to give your product its best chance of getting to market. And in the public sector, there's more than those 8. You know, aligning people, getting buy-in, encouraging your peers and the people above you to get on board. There could be more than 8. These are just the 8 most obvious ones in a private sector situation. Well, the answer to most of those is quite simple. Get close to your users or customers. You know, before you start, get close to them and find out more and more about them. And that includes the buyer at Tesco in the example of the potato peeler. And of course, we are going to say this because we are the Design Age Institute. Design is one of the key tools to doing all that. Because good design makes products and services useful, usable, and desirable for people. And those 3 things are hugely important. It must have a use, you know, it must solve a problem. It must be usable ergonomically or within the system of use. People must want it. And then there's co-design, you know, supports good design by involving people in every aspect of the design process. And of course, at the Helen Hammond Centre and at Design Age Institute, we embrace inclusive design mainly, and because this achieves this for as many people as reasonably possible without the need for special adaptation. And that's what we'll be looking at the Design Age Institute when people come to us with ideas. Can we be confident of being successful on the 8 key steps, and how can we use design to be as confident as possible? In other words, before you start your journey, make sure as many of the traffic lights ahead of you are green before you put your foot on the accelerator. And of course, just to remind you all, embrace your inner Keith. Thank you. Chris, back to you.
Thanks very much, Colin. I am now just going to see if I can take back control. I should have said at the beginning, though we did pretty well, that if any Zoom glitches came up, if people could be patient and go easy on us, but luckily I think we sort of got through that fairly harm-free. So now I'm just going to pull up the Q&A so I can have a look at what's been said and what's been answered already. We have a question here from Algae. He says, "Hi, thanks for the talks. With the personalization of products, it is, of course, vital to understand users' preferences. When people can't engage with questionnaires, etc., to develop designs, have alternative methods been looked into, e.g. evolutionary psychology, anthropology, ethnography, and observation?" I'm wondering if anyone would particularly like to address this. Yeah, Colin?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a huge fan of ethnographic research. I was having a cup of tea with an ethnographic research company yesterday afternoon, talking about how they can maybe sit in our advisory group and make sure that the tools and techniques they use are heavily involved. So yes, I'm a big fan of that approach. And certainly questionnaires, are useful as part of the double diamond process, but only in part of it when you want to verify things or validate things. But when you're looking for insight, when you're looking for creativity, then you got to work with people.
Yeah, no, I would echo that. I think every project within the age and diversity research space, this is kind of the first step almost, to use design ethnography, if you like, and we have on staff at the Helen Hammond Centre anthropologists. So I think it's absolutely key to engage with people from the beginning. And it's that classic of, it's not designing for, it's designing with, or even moving to, in some senses, designing by the people that we're hoping to design, with and for. Would anyone else like to chip in, or shall I move on to the next question?
I'll just say something quickly. I think it's important on the project that I'm working on. We have quite a range of different abilities, and it became very apparent very quickly in our research that 40% of kids that have ADHD also have ASD, and so they have very specific needs on textures and materials. And so it's going to be super key as we move into the next phase, if we start to co-design, to actually start to group the different kinds of materials and textures that are acceptable to these different groups, and then try to come up with a kind of you know, 4 or 5 product approach that we can actually take to market.
Brilliant.
I also would just like to add as well, and similarly for my project in going forward with Community Tree, you know, evolving something with technology, especially with an older audience. You know, there are such varied abilities and skills that these users have in terms of using technology. You know, some people are very, very tech savvy and can do online banking, and others, you know, struggle to do very basic things. And so that you know, ethnographic research and designing with people and them being the co-authors of this, you know, outcome is extremely important, because there's just such a wide range of people and abilities. And so trying to gather all that through ethnographic research is really key, and it's been key throughout the whole of this project.
Brilliant. Thanks, guys. So I'm going to jump on to, whoa, it's all moving around. Alexandra's question, which has been upvoted next. And it reads, I'd be interested in the statement what users stroke people need versus what people want. Could you maybe elaborate a bit further on this, please? Are we sure that people can always express what they want? Of course, there's delights and wishes that can be expressed. I feel that the uncovering of underlying needs from the research can unveil even more what maybe was not expressed by wants. So I think that's kind of commenting or pointing towards one of your slides, Colm. So if you're okay for jumping in first.
Yeah, so we, you know, we need all sorts of things. We need to stop smoking. We need to drink less, take more exercise, look after ourselves, better diet. You know, the world is full of needs, things that we need to do. But until we want to do them, you know, they tend not to happen. You know, you get to a point where, you know, suddenly you've put on a bit of weight and you want to lose weight, or you're feeling really unhealthy and you want to give up smoking. So there's that mixture of needs and wants. And they are hugely important that people tend to spend more money and are more inclined to do things they want compared to what they need. And we can look, you know, around at coronavirus. You know, nobody needs to go to the pub. People want to go to the pub, and even though they know it's dangerous and maybe contributing to the spread, you know, they you know, okay, they need social interaction, but they want to go to the pub. You know, so we have to play into that and start looking at what people want, and hopefully aligning that with what they need. And in terms of, people are not great at expressing it all the time. Two of the areas that the Helen Hammond Centre are very strong on, you know, which I help work on, were things like autism and dementia, where people can't express anything. You know, a lot of people are non-verbal, so you have to work kind of with their carers in proxy or through ethnographic research, observations, any way you can to try to understand what people want, what motivates them, what interests them, what excites them, and then use that to help supply their needs. At least that's what's worked best so far, but certainly happy to take any suggestions. If anybody's got any, you know, kind of golden nugget, we'll take it.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer, and I think that's true. I mean, I'm reminded of those projects myself, Colm, those ones where, you know, part of the design process, part of that kind of messy journey was, okay, we have people here that are non-verbal and want to express needs and wants in different ways. So how do we create platforms or opportunities for that to be captured, for real conversations to be had? And often that would involve, you know, more than the target user. You know, it would be much broader groups of people, circles of care, and then towards your production thing, you know, like understanding everyone in the journey to get something to market, for example, bringing them all into the conversation. And it's that balance of needs and wants. I mean, we also worked a little bit on a project called Qualified Self, and that was about trying to get people to behave in more healthy ways, I guess, like your pub thing. But I think what was really crucial to that was understanding what nudges would actually have any impact. Like people's own health preferences came into it. You know, does pub trump, I don't know, going for a jog? And it's like, okay, well, how about pub a little less? Think about a jog. You know, it's this balancing act around what we kind of know is good and what is someone else's personal, I guess, view on their health needs, health behaviors, what will bring them more well-being. Would anyone else like to chip in? I noticed the questions are going ding, 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 as our minutes are running out. So if we don't get time to answer all these questions, we will answer them alongside the video that will go up on the website afterwards. So don't worry if your question doesn't make it here. I'm just going down the list of the ones that have been voted up, and we will take some time to answer everything. Would anyone like to chip in Alexandra's, or shall we move on? Okay, I'm going to pop on to the next one. Next, oh, moving about again. Next, we have a question from Fanny, who asked, or who stated, brilliant work, thanks for sharing. How can we create more awareness on inclusive design in other design institutions? Can you share what worked for you to create such a great department at the RCA? It's very nice and flattering. Would anyone, well, I guess I'm just quickly, I mean, I'm kind of off the top of my head here. I mean, and I'm very flattered by what was said there. I think designers more broadly, the design industry, inclusion is a much more sort of more commonly heard. I think when I joined the centre over 15 years ago, I think like, yeah, 16, 17 years ago, it seemed like inclusion and inclusive design was an incredibly hard sell, particularly to industry partners. But it seems there is a little bit of a tipping point here where people are starting, like with the Design Age Institute, I guess, people are beginning to recognize needs and market potential. So in a purely, you know, business sense, I think design institutions will begin to see that there's an industry draw. I also think just from working in not only the RCA, but some other institutions, I think that there has been a shift in sort of design ambition from students and graduates, where it's not all about a more kind of egocentric expression of what they think's best. I think there's a real drive across every design department to really understand issues and problems and frame challenges in a more reflective and considered way. So I feel like things are moving that way, actually. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts how we can create more awareness around inclusive design in other design institutions. And I guess collaboration is another bit. Has anyone got any thoughts?
Yeah, it's just doing what we're doing now. It's just getting the message out, talking publicly, and trying to be as open and free with what we know as possible. And, you know, for the greater good. It's, you know, yes, of course, we've all got IP we want to protect, but it's about sharing as much as possible. But it's not an easy thing, because you were saying you were doing it for 15 years. I know that Roger Coleman and Jeremy Morrison have been doing it for 29, or is it the 30th anniversary this year, something
30,
like that?
Yeah, 30.
You know, so it's tough work getting industry, both health and private sector, to really understand extreme user groups and involve and include them in the process, and not exclude them accidentally, which is the worst of all, where through something really simple you could have included, you know, these extremes. You know, so it's that not doing it accidentally, but it just takes a long time to get the message out. It's like any marketing campaign. But yeah, all we can do is talk, provide the evidence and show examples.
Yeah, I think that's it. I think that's definitely part of it, is getting it out there. I remember a quote, it was Jasper Morrison, and he said, design for life, not for magazine covers. And I think what comes from that, if you design well for life, it kind of ends up in the magazine covers as well. You know, like if the design is good and people are engaged, I think people start to recognize it. And there's something in that, like just getting it out there, spreading the message, and people kind of aspiring for greater design. You know, I think these days people ignore design that ignores them. So I think good design almost sells itself. Would anyone else like to chip in? I know we are now a couple of minutes over. We did start a couple of minutes late. I know the panelists earlier on, I bribed them and they said they would hang on for an extra 5 or so minutes. So we can maybe take another question, or in fact, I mean, it's probably, useful to just mention what the polls came out with, and maybe people can respond. So Will, your question, if our ultimate goal is a more inclusive future, which of these themes from our project do you think need to change the most? And the themes you highlighted were transport, hospitals, work, and clothing and shoes. And C absolutely smashed it. It was over 60% of votes. Have you any thoughts on what that might mean? What your response would be?
I think it's interesting that there's such a clear winner, as so to speak, with that poll. But I do think there was a couple of comments actually raised in the chat about this question, and one of the audience members highlighted that they would have liked to actually been able to select them all, and made a comment that perhaps it's the attitudes that underpin all of these things that are the most vital things that need to change. And Colin rightly responded to that by saying until attitudes change, then interventions in the built environment or physical interventions will be less useful. So I think although it's interesting that work comes up above hospitals, transport and clothing, I think the two things I would say is there are things that underpin all of these things, which are things like attitudes, that I think are the fundamentals that we need to address, and that these are intersectional issues as well. These are not, oppression or discrimination in any of these one areas is not devoid of oppression or discrimination in any of the others. So I think that, these are an intersectional kind of issues.
Absolutely. Complex and overlapping. Okay, the next question or poll from Imran. During the COVID lockdown, everyone gained a sense of what life as a vulnerable person confined within their home for months on end might feel like. Which of the 4 challenge spaces that emerged in this project did you experience most? So getting people to reflect on their own experience. And again, there was quite a gap between the top answer, though it might be everyone wanted to choose everything again, like you say, Will. But in yours, Imran, it was the need for stronger community, which came out again, not far off 60% of the votes cast. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that COVID has probably exacerbated this need more than ever, at least in my lifetime for sure. But what's really interesting is that I think we've had a great insight into how much people are willing to come together and support one another during these last 5 or 6 months, from even clapping for key workers on Thursday, where, I know that I met a lot of people on my street who I still kind of keep in contact with from that initial start. And, even around my area, people pledging to support local business to keep them afloat during this time. I actually think that this is the perfect time to address the need of building strong communities, because it's just that there is a need, and I would personally be more than happy to actually host a larger discussion or online session to learn more about actually, your experiences as the audience here today. So, and think about how we can kind of tackle this together, because I think that right now is the time to strike when the iron's hot, and actually, not just having that community, but how to have it safely, seeing as we're not used to that conventional idea of being in the physical space together and having that sense of community. So please feel free to contact me, any of the viewers after this presentation. I'd be happy to follow up and organize something where we can discuss and think about how we can challenge this together.
Perfect, right? So an invitation to everyone to continue this discussion about the new emerging communities and how they work, and I guess the tensions between, especially in your project, that physical digital dynamic. So the last poll question, and I think we'll see how we get on, but we're nearly at 10 past, and I know our speakers have to rush off and do various other things. But Steve, your poll, although all of the following issues are important to solve, which do you think will be the most critical to get right? And yours was much closer, actually. So the options were avoiding stigmatization amongst other children, making sure the product is adopted by children, minimal products interaction for parents and doctors, and cost engineering the product so it's easily replaceable. And I know because of my involvement with the project, that they are all kind of critical. But the people viewing thought A and B, avoiding stigmatization amongst other children and making sure the product is adopted by the wearer were the highest sort of ranking. Any thoughts or reflections on that?
I tend to agree with them. I think when you think about the minimal interaction from product parents and doctors and teachers and whatnot, yes, they're overstretched, but if this thing's really useful, they can find ways to overcome these things. And similarly with the costing of the thing, if the thing's really valuable and it's really, really helps with accuracy, then those sort of things can be overcome. People will let certain things slide. I think the top two probably are the most important. The interesting thing about the stigmatization that we've learned through the research, and I probably should have mentioned this as I was going through the presentation, is we're working with kids that are 6 to 11, right? And what I've learned through talking to teachers is these kids are a lot more kind of caring these days about everybody else in their class. I think part of how education has kind of enlightened us all of, the needs of people with, special educational needs. I think things have changed and things have moved on. And so it seems like they're a lot more caring and a lot less likely to stigmatize other children. I think when it gets to secondary school, all bets could be off. Who knows what happens at secondary school? I think we all have varying memories of what that was like. I think one of the key things definitely is, how do we make sure that children adopt this? As we've gone through the research, we've had anecdotes from other studies, and one in particular stuck in my head that I heard about, which was it was a heart rate monitor for primary school children, and this thing has obviously been designed by engineers because it turned up at the house and it was this giant metal block that these kids were expected to wear on their wrists for quite a period of time, and it kind of failed at the first hurdle because they hadn't kind of done that whole MVP thing of making sure not only is it functional, but it's also reliable, usable, and has some emotional connection to the user. So for me at the moment, that's probably where I'm going to put most of my efforts in this product.
Brilliant. Yeah, no, I can totally see that. There was, I guess there was that difference in the options. There was a very pragmatic engineering, getting the costing and the design, the components right. And then the other two were much more about that human experience. How will this be worn? How will people experience it in school? What will be reactions from other kids? Now, I'm happy to hear you're getting this sort of positive experience from the kids you're interacting with. That there's more empathy and more understanding of different needs. I think that's a nice note, probably for us to kind of finish up on. I know we're 10 minutes past. As I said, these questions are not going to be ignored. We'll take some time to answer them all after this, and it'll be up on our website afterwards. So I would just like to thank the speakers. They were brilliant presentations, a real blend, and I think really thought-provoking, a lot for us to take away and reflect on. And thanks to everyone out there that's listening. We appreciate you coming, and if there's something that interests you in particular, do reach out. Our doors are always open. So thanks very much, everyone, and take care.